I would like to introduce our wonderful speaker for today, Mr. Franz Sedelmayer, born in Munich, Germany. And I'm just going to, you folks are here for a wonderful treat. As I read just the beginning of the biography and also the summary of the book, Welcome to Putingrad, that he's planning to explain, how fascinating what he's going to explain to all of us. Just for your information, as an introduction, the author, Mr. Sedelmayer, at age 26, went to St. Petersburg, Russia, where he built a police supply, or policy supply, police supply? He built a police supply?
Law enforcement supply.
Law enforcement supply. Thank you for clarification, and training company. One of his biggest supporters was St. Petersburg young deputy mayor, a former KGB lieutenant colonel named Vladimir Putin. The two bonded. Mr. Putin and Mr. Sedelmayer bonded. And Franz Russian company was expropriated. His multi-million-dollar investment lost. Franz was hounded out of Russia. Putin, ambitious, political, and ruthless, let it happen. And because he did, he landed his first Moscow post. Franz sought arbitration and won. But Russia refused to pay damages. He foreclosed on Russia state property in Western Europe. To stop him, Moscow brought 140 court cases. It failed. Franz is the only individual ever to collect money from Putin's Russia. It is a great honor for us as an academic institution, Utah Valley University, to welcome Mr. Franz Sedelmayer. Let's give him a hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's my pleasure to be here back in Utah, a place I really like. I came here the first time when I was 16 years old. Some of my good old friends are sitting right here in the audience. Thank you very much for coming. Mr. Sandlich, thank you very much for having me. Mr. Baldomero, thank you so much for organizing, and Amy, of course. I'm going to give the talk for about 45 minutes and to be followed by question and answer. So if you guys have anything, please go ahead and ask later. My name is Franz Sedelmayer. I'm actually born and raised in Munich, Germany. I come from a family that was for 4 generations in the automotive business. We also supplied specialized vehicles to law enforcement all across the world. And at age 26, I got an invitation to come to Leningrad, then still USSR, by their police department to see what they have available as far as equipment taxes is concerned. They were in dire straits because organized crime raised its ugly head, and the police force was not equipped to handle that type of situation. And I went over there out of curiosity, but always with a little bit of this fear in mind. I'm dealing here with a communist police state, so I don't know what I'm in for, so I was treading very lightly and very carefully. And I probably had the best week of my life ever in business. We had meetings that started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the last meeting would be over by 2 o'clock at night, with people from all walks of life, politics, the Communist Party, and you cannot imagine who all was knocking at the hotel door. And I could see there is a wonderful opportunity because the country is no longer just a totalitarian communist regime or society. It's actually breathing fresh air. You could literally smell it. You could look around. You could see everything was a little derelict, everything was a little bit in bad shape, but thank God we were in Leningrad, in St. Petersburg, which is a wonderful city. If you ever go to Russia, forget Moscow, I always say. Go to St. Petersburg. It's wonderful. It's really a sight, and it will take you probably years to see everything they have to offer. There's so much culture there. So I was intrigued, and I kept on coming back, and eventually I came with the opinion, if I want to service this market, I have to be there on the ground in Russia. So I was looking for ways to make that happen. And we found a compound in Stone Island in Kameny Ostrov, very close to St. Petersburg. which was the police residence. And we turned that into a headquarter of a joint venture, a 50-50 joint venture with the Leningrad Police Department at the time. And I figured it's a very wise move to associate myself with the state rather than with private interests, because the private interests, to a certain extent, the people that had money and did some commerce, there was a little bit of a question how they obtained those funds. So in 1992, I ran into some confrontations with some corrupt elements in the police force. So I was going over to the consulate, and I said to the American consulate, we had a US company out of St. Louis, Missouri, and I said, what am I going to do? And one of those guys that I talked to in the consulate said, you know what, there's this Vladimir Putin, he has a soft spot for the Germans. Go and talk to him. So I went through some of my contacts, and I set up a meeting, and I met a younger, 36-year-old lieutenant colonel retired, Vladimir Putin, and I sat down with my translator and looked around. We were sitting at a very small conference table. He's a rather small person, he's about 8 tall. He came across very familiar to me, exactly like a German civil servant, rather a little bit of arrogant stature, a little bit pressed for time, as if he had better things to do than deal with me. And I looked around, and there was not many documents at his desk, so I don't think he was very busy. But in any case, my translator and I sat down, and we started the conversation, and after 30 seconds, he said in German, halt. He spoke fluent German, so the German bureaucrat was complete. I was now talking with a man in German who was actually not willing to do anything for me. He basically said, my job here is to make sure that our mayor has no problems with anyone. And I left the office and basically found out that he was working for Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, who was the first democratically elected mayor of Leningrad at the time. This is 1992. And unfortunately, Mr. Sobchak did what happens in Russia all over these days. He unfortunately was on the take. And Mr. Putin's sole mission in those days was to fix problems for his mayor. And he was very good at it. He was very loyal to it. So I was looking for ways to cultivate my relationship with the city better, because one of Putin's questions to me was, what have you ever done for Leningrad? What are you doing for us? Why should we help you? And basically, we had interlocking, connecting people that were in law enforcement, and we agreed that we would sponsor and train pro bono certain elements in the police force and certain elements in their intelligence services, which we did. And once Putin saw that we actually contributing something to society, we had a very good working relationship, which lasted all the way until 1996. In 1996, unfortunately, my company, which grew very successfully, we had about 150 people working for us, and we basically supplied all the 15 republics of the former Soviet Union. As you remember, in 1991, the end of the year, the 31st, the Soviet Union imploded. What used to be USSR was now 15 republics, Russia, of course, being the biggest and still most important one. We had fantastic real estate in Kameny Ostrov on Stone Island, and President Yeltsin visited the island and took a liking to our real estate. So before we knew it, we ended up on a list of expropriated properties that were attributed to the Upravlenie delami Prezidenta Rossijской Federacji, which is the property department or the managing department of the President of the Russian Federation. That organization has been founded by Mr. Lenin right after the October Revolution, and it held the assets of all the private assets that the communists took away from the noble families, from rich people, and basically put it in. It had grown under the management of the Communist Party, not the state, the Communist Party, to a $600 billion value company, which is government-owned, government-controlled, and only controlled by the president. It used to be the chairman of the Communist Party, and now it was the first thing that Mr. Yeltsin took away from the Communist Party after the putsch right before the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Right after August, it was one of the first documents he signed to take it over for the Russian president. And with the expropriation came the problem that we were looking for ways to continue our work in Russia. So the person that broke the news to us was, of course, Vladimir Putin with some other officials. We were sitting in his office, and he was saying, well, I said, the only thing the city can do for you, we give you real estate, same island. So I said, great, wonderful. So he gave me 2 addresses. I went, I looked, no roof, no windows, no doors, half burned. Air conditioning was great. But it would have taken us another $1 million or $2 million to build up, and we already had invested $1 million in renovating our old place. So I went back to Mr. Putin and I said, look, Vladimir, I said, we cannot work like this because I'm not going to put my money in again and then renovate it, and then somebody else will come and take it away from us. That's not a good idea. So he said, okay, let me find out who's dealing with these issues in Moscow. And I came back 2 days later. I said, I found a man. His name is Pavel Borodin. He's the chief of the Upravlenie de la Presidenta. And he's responsible for compensation because the city has no money, as you know. No valuta in any case, and no ruble. Not 1 ruble left for you. And I said, fine, no problem. So we wrote a letter to Mr. Borodin in Moscow and said, we'd like to have back $899,000 US. That's the cost of our leasehold improvements, which we need to rebuild the other place. And then about a week later, to our big surprise, a letter comes back. I'm sorry, no compensation for you, Mr. Sedelmayer. Your company was established illegally. Which was sort of funny because Mr. Putin was in charge of external relations, much like Franz Kolb used to be in charge for the state of Utah, attracting businesses here. And he also had registered our company, so our company was legal by all formalities. So Mr. Putin said, basically, I'm giving up. I'm not going to get involved with this. I'm not going to take a confrontational position here because I still have a career to make. As we can all see, he was right. But he was honest enough to tell me that there's not much he can do, and basically said, without compensation, we are not moving. So we had like a Mexican standoff for about a year until they marched in. When I was absent, I was not in the country, and they took over the facility, they confiscated everything on the ground, and then actually turned over my company, including its personnel and its director, to a company that was owned by the FSB, which is the successor organization of the KGB. And they used it as a guarding structure, and it's still existing until today, including some of the personnel that I had employed at the time. So I was waiting for, not waiting, I was looking for opportunities how I could get even, because I had addressed some Russian courts and the Russian prosecutor, citing all types of violations of Russian law, which was the case, but of course, not a single court accepted any of the applications that we put in. I mean, normally you just go to court, you file your lawsuit, and then you lose, worst case scenario. In our case, they didn't even accept the case. They sent it right back. The prosecutor wouldn't give us an answer. They just ignored it. So we knew we were not going to make any headway in Russia. So a friend of mine had given me a book that he wrote. It's called Das Russlandgeschäft, Doing Business in Russia. And it had, and when I got it in 1991, when I opened shop, I took it, said thank you very much, and I put it on my shelf, and I never looked at it. And I found that book, and I opened it, and guess what? It had in there a chapter on protection of investment, of foreign investment. And what happened is Russia and the Soviet Union in 1989 had signed a bilateral investment treaty, which is an international treaty which became law of the land both in Germany and in the Soviet Union, and of course then in Russia as a successor to the Soviet Union. And it basically contains an arbitration clause that in the case of nationalization or situations that have a similar effect, that if an investor from the other state is not compensated or not compensated in a fair amount, he has the right to bring arbitration in a neutral forum. In our case, that would be Sweden. And what it did, it opened us a neutral forum, and it opened us a private court, an arbitration tribunal, which worked under ad hoc rules, which means it's not institutionalized rules, so it makes its own procedures as it goes along. And what that will do for you, it will give you a fair shot at compensation. And what it will do for the foreign state is to send a signal, actually, you should settle this matter before you get an arbitration award. Reason being, every country is interested, as is Utah, for example, to attract foreign investment by showing this is a place with the rule of law. We protect your interests, we protect your property, we treat you fairly, we tax you fairly. You have nothing to fear from us. So Russia was still in dire straits in those days, even in 1996, because they couldn't get enough investment. It's a huge country. So we figured this thing might not even go to arbitration. It might be just enough to send the invitation for them to give us a fair compensation. And to our surprise, they wrote back to the tribunal, it's not a good idea to pick a fight with the Russian Federation, which was more or less an unreal threat. But initially, it already shows you the attitude that has prevailed until today. And so we won the arbitration. And I said, well, you know, they have to pay now because there would be a loss of face. I didn't know that it's an unknown concept in Russia. A bureaucrat, a politician that is faced with a situation like this, is in a very hard spot, because if he pays up, he lost his reputation. So the only thing he can do is to throw money at the problem and make it difficult for people to enforce, which is exactly what we had to do. And it took us over 15 years to actually get paid at the end of the day. And what we ended up doing is we ended up confiscating through the courts their trade missions in Sweden and their trade missions in Germany. Not the whole trade mission, but certain real estate. And the beauty of enforcement against states is, and I'm saying this sarcastically, that the state can always say, excuse me, you cannot foreclose, you cannot have these assets because we use it for a sovereign purpose. For example, we have an embassy or there at the location, or we have an account that only contributes to the budget necessary for the work of the embassy or consulate in our country, or for the trade mission, which comes under the same rulings. And so they have a wonderful instrument which they're trying to bring into existence, and I always have to read it from the paper. It's called the United Nations Convention on Jurisdictional Immunities of States and Their Property. And it's a convention that was drawn up by the International Law Commission of the United Nations. And it basically, when you read it prima facie, you will see you can only enforce against assets belonging to foreign states if they agree to the enforcement, which of course is ridiculous. How can you make a state agree to pay you? That doesn't work. So we went back into the history of this treaty, which, by the way, is not yet enacted. However, being international law, you see that France, Belgium, the Netherlands are all adopting the very same text of that treaty into their own law, because they're now being faced not by little people like me looking for $1 million here or $100,000 there, but by UCOs, for example, which are looking for $50 billion, which is a little more, of course. And so what we saw is that the International Legal Commission had actually discussed the matter at hand, and what they had agreed on was the following. In case someone comes, a creditor, to enforce against a state on the territory of another state, then the host state is free, if he wants to avoid a diplomatic conflict, to pay up instead of the state that owes the money. That is one thing. And the second thing it says, this law, this paragraph is based on the law of the sea, meaning you can have a vessel going on the sea that is either serving a sovereign purpose, like a warship, or you have a merchant vessel which serves a commercial purpose, and commercial purposes are not exempt from attachment. And so what our Russian friends had done is they turned half their embassies and consulates and trade missions around the world into private real estate. And they rented it to fashion designers, jewelers, office space they leased out to people, etc. So it became then a mixed use. And the mixed use is no longer protected. And that is what we had used, and that is how we got to foreclose on 7 pieces of real estate. Even though it took us 11 years, we set the precedent for that. And that's what Russia, of course, protested. In the case of Sweden, we had an interesting story. We had Mr. Carl Bildt, who was the foreign minister. And Mr. Bildt issued an order to the bailiff service of Sweden, to the Kronofogden, saying, we don't want you to continue with the foreclosure of said trade mission real estate, period. And we looked at this and said, how can it be that a foreign secretary of a country tells an organ of the judiciary what to do? This would be unconstitutional. So we filed a complaint. Now, I'm not Swedish, I'm just a German. So we filed a complaint with the Riksdagen, which is the Swedish parliament. And guess what? They put together a commission which reprimanded Mr. Bildt from interfering into the judiciary. So on all fronts, you're not welcome when you're trying to enforce against Russia in any country. I don't think we would be welcome here in the United States if we were trying to do that. But that just comes with the territory. Anyway, the main thing is we succeeded. It took longer than usual. The problem was we were the first ones. Now, having said that, let's talk a little bit about the Russia that we have today. Let's talk a little bit about the Putin that we have today and our problems with it. I mean, for me, it's a very interesting situation. Not situation, it's actually very interesting for me just to read the American press right now, on the internet or in a newspaper, listen to your television channels, and see all the hype associated with so-called the Russia collusion, which I think is very interesting, and people being outraged that a country like Russia could interfere into the affairs of another country. And I'm like remembering the days of the Cold War when I was a kid. That was an everyday occurrence. But at the time, we understood the message coming from Moscow. And somehow along the lines, we have lost that ability to listen. And we also have lost the ability to understand what they want from us, which is very interesting. When Mr. Putin got to Moscow, his first position was, he was the chief of the international department of the Upravlение Delami Presidenta, which is the organization that actually handled my expropriation. So when I went into arbitration, he was actually the one that was sending the lawyers from Moscow to face me in arbitration. It's a very small world sometimes. And we actually traded little hellos via the lawyers coming in from Moscow. After that, he went on to become a person that showed his capabilities and also had a reputation for being loyal to whoever he worked for. So the Yeltsin family very quickly understood that would be the man that might be solving their problem, because Mr. Yeltsin's time in office was running out. There was a 2-term limit in the new Russian constitution, so his time was limited. Unfortunately, his family was very much involved in fleecing the country, but of course at a much smaller scale as we have it today. And so they knew when Mr. Yeltsin would leave office, somebody is going to ask questions and somebody is going to jail. So they promoted him to become the chief of KGB, and his first scenario at the time was he was faced with an independent prosecutor general that was investigating the Yeltsin family in the so-called Mabitex scandal. What has happened is Mabitex is an Albanian company, Albanian-owned company from Switzerland. They do construction. And this construction company obtained all the contracts to renovate all the sites in Russia, including the Kremlin. And the public money that went into Mabitex somehow ended up on bank accounts that belonged to the family of Mr. Yeltsin, including credit cards. And it was not done in a fashion to hide those funds. It was easily identifiable. And the Swiss authorities started investigating this situation. And all of a sudden, Mr. Yeltsin and his family were faced with a criminal investigation against them. The acting president was immune, but not his immediate family members. So Mr. Putin was tasked to take care of the situation. So he had presented a videotape, which was shown on public television in a matter of a month, showing the prosecutor general having a jolly good time with two ladies of the night in a Moscow hotel. Of course, if it was the person or not, we will never know, because the quality of black and white video footage was not so great that he could really say if that's the person. But as far as the prosecutor general was concerned, that was the end of his career. So Mr. Skuratov took leave from the office, and now is teaching at a law school somewhere out in Siberia. But he's still around. But the problem was solved. So that was Mr. Putin's first political kill, and that's what got him earmarked for becoming the prime minister of Russia, where again, he went, of course, to do the bidding for the Yeltsin family. Then in 1999, if you recall, he was appointed acting president, and then later in 2000, early in the year, he won the popular elections. And when he became prime minister, one thing that really stuck, was really a problem for Mr. Putin, nobody would take him seriously, because Mr. Yeltsin was changing prime ministers literally every 2 to 3 months. So it was very much an ejection seat. It was not a very stable position to be in. And miraculously, the Second Chechen War broke out, right after we had apartment buildings blown up in Russia, in Moscow, and which was a very strange scenario, because after the second building had exploded, a month later, they arrested a KGB crew that was planting explosives in an apartment house. And they arrested, the local police arrested them, not knowing who they were, because they just could identify they're planting a chemical substance, which was an industrial explosive, a granulate. And they arrested everybody, and then the local KGB chief came in, or FSB chief came in, and basically said, that's my guys, they're from Moscow, and I'll take them out, they shouldn't be here. And the explosives were stored at an army base, and the local soldiers guarding those explosives thought it was sugar. One of them helped himself to a spoon and found out it was not sugar. It didn't taste very well. So this whole investigation stopped. It went nowhere. The KGB claimed, or the FSB claimed, it was an exercise. So the basis for the second conflict in Chechnya was exactly the terrorist attacks. So people rightfully asked the question, who had anything to do with it? Was it a provocation or not? But what it did at the time was it rallied the Russian people around Russia. They're very patriotic people, as you know. And it helped Putin to sustain himself, to expose himself as a very macho, decisive person. He was there leading the war from the front, as we say. He was present daily, every minute on public television. Overnight, he basically became a person they were looking for, someone who is a strong leader, someone who is punishing these people. And that helped him tremendously, of course, when the popular election came in 2000, and he won with a 60% majority, something like that. And once he was in power, and there's a wonderful documentary, which is, I think, even available on YouTube, which shows that President Yeltsin picks up the phone to contact his protege, Vladimir Putin, and to congratulate him to this wonderful win of the elections. And Mr. Putin does not answer the phone. And as a matter of fact, he and Mr. Vladimir Putin and Mr. Yeltsin had never spoken again after that time, because now Mr. Putin was in charge, which is very much a character trait. Mr. Putin understands what power is about. He's an administrator, he's a fixer. He's a very interesting person when it comes to talking to people. His initial training, his job was to be a recruiter. His mission was to recruit informants. I'm not talking high-class, high-level spies. I'm talking ordinary people They would tell him ordinary things about everyday life in East Germany. That was, at the time, his thing. When the wall came down, he returned to Leningrad, officially leaving the KGB, being reassigned to someone else by the FSB to take care of the young, aspiring Democrat, Anatoly Sobchak, who would be mayor one day. And when you sit across from Mr. Putin, he will use his training because you will be looking in the mirror. He will try to be like you. He will try to create sympathy, empathy. He will try to lure you in. He will convince you, you are my friend. Now, when you look at what George W. Bush said about Mr. Putin, he said something very interesting. I looked into the man's eyes, and I think I can work with him. And then you have Senator McCain on the other side, who says, I looked into Putin's eyes, and all I saw was a cold-blooded KGB killer. And it shows you Putin is a person, he's very good one-on-one. That's his training. He can change his colors in a second. I've seen it during other conversations when we had meetings. And he's a person that will assess you, and that's how he will treat you. And if he has a feeling you're not as important as, for example, he might have thought of Mr. McCain, he will treat him completely differently than he would treat Mr. George W. Bush. And that shows you that he's very much a people person. Interesting also for me is to watch a little bit Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. You know, they have more things in common than what sets them apart. It's very interesting. They're both rather short-tempered. They're both a little vain, to put it mildly. They're both sometimes saying things no other politician would dare saying on live television. They don't like to read papers and documents and study files. They have people that do that for them. They rely very much on people briefing them, Twitter style. Putin is not a very patient man. One of his most important co-workers at the time was Igor Ivanovich Sechin, who is now the chief of the largest oil company in the world, Rosneft. The reason they get along so fabulously because Putin said, what do I have to do today, Igor Ivanovich? And Igor Ivanovich had prepared all the documents, and Putin would make his resolution, and said, please do this. And that is his modus operandi. Of course, he has never changed that. And Mr. Trump, as we all know, apparently has a lot of the same traits when it comes to work. They're both very much stomach people. They decide at the spur of the moment. They're both people who will not necessarily plan for the next 5 or 10 years. I mean, I always read in the press what a wonderful strategist Mr. Putin is because he's got everything earmarked out for the next 10 or 15 years, what Russia should be and how the world should be. And actually, Mr. Putin has this big problem of corruption right now. He's literally holding on every day to his seat as a president because the sad truth is, with all the corruption going on in Russia at the moment, with his family, with his friends, there's really not much of a place to go to once he's no longer president. And this is his biggest nightmare. What's going to happen after I lose power? When you lose power in Russia, you're reduced to nothing. You no longer have the influence that you have. When you look at how Mr. Putin treated Mr. Yeltsin, you will know how Mr. Putin will be treated when he leaves office one day. And this is a situation where Mr. Putin, of course, will try to do anything to hold on to power because he doesn't want to end up on the bad side of things. And the problem will be for him, if he would step down, if he is corrupt, as people claim he is, how is he going to get his money? Is he going to walk up to his oligarch friend and say, by the way, Ivan, can I have my $5 billion, please? Do you think Ivan is a nice person and will just give it to him? I think it might be more likely Ivan will say, I'm sorry. You're not kidding. So it's a catch-22, if not jail time. He could be really in a very bad position. So whenever the regime ends up in a situation where there's people in the street protesting, election rigging, for example, corruption. We've seen many, many young people in the streets since last year, as young as 12 years old. They actually do something very interesting. They go out into the street and they have a conviction that they're doing the right thing. And they're discovering, step by step, all the corruption that goes on into the country, all these little palaces these people build for themselves. They declare an income of $50,000 or $100,000 being working as a minister in the cabinet of the Russian Federation, but they live at a piece of real estate which is worth 25 or 50 million. So nobody is looking at that. Navalny is one of the people who is actually, he was trying to run for president. He was convicted of a crime, of fraud, to be exact. And Mr. Navalny then went to complain to the European Court of Human Rights, and they lifted the judgment, saying he didn't have a fair trial. So by rights, he should be allowed to run against Mr. Putin. The elections are in 2 months from now. And in reality, of course, Putin will not allow him to run because he would run a really serious risk that he might lose the elections, or that Mr. Navalny might get so many votes that he has to make some type of arrangement with someone else. So of course, they're trying to leave him out. But what Navalny did for many years, he has been exposing the beneficiaries of theft, right-out theft, fleecing the country, the Russian Federation. And people get this over the social media now, over Twitter, Facebook. It's unfiltered news. The older generation, people like me, we like to read newspapers, physical. We like to watch state-controlled television. And of course, you never hear anything about that. So these young people go into the streets, and they go there, and now they're being arrested by people who are their fathers. And Putin has created a police force now. He basically took all the uniformed police force that, what we call the troops of the Minister of Interior, which is 435,000 people strong, and he put him under his direct command as a defense against people in the street that could oust him one day. So you can see these people are arresting now these 12, 14, 16-year-old kids, and when you look at the pictures, they're not happy about doing that, because that's not what they signed up for. They were signed up for to fight crime, if nothing else. It's not to arrest their own children, practically. So the situation is in very much a flux, but every time he ends up being confronted with this type of situation, there's a conflict breaking out. There's an annexation of Crimea. There's an invasion of Georgia, specifically Abkhazia, which is part of the Georgian territory. There will be a conflict in eastern Ukraine. There is all of a sudden a military involvement in Syria, bombing everything that moves on the ground, marking it a counter-terrorist operation, and using Soviet arsenal, because the Russian military-industrial complex is a far cry away from what it used to be in the Soviet days. They have a real economic problem. To give you a number you might relate to, Russia's GDP is 1/20th of that of the United States. So if you put this into context, what it means to be able to sustain a longer military operation someplace, the Russians are operating at maximum capacity. When you read the American press, you think the guy could invade tomorrow because he's so strong. This is not the case. We're overvaluing their capabilities. We're overvaluing their aims. They're very successful in dividing the West. They're very successful in sowing distrust. We have seen in the European Union that all of a sudden our countries, especially the countries that came and joined us after the wall came down, actually developed sympathy for Putin's Russia. We have every single alt-right or alt-left party that does anything in Europe is being financed by the Russian Federation or someone close to the Russian Federation. We have a former chancellor by the name of Gerhard Schröder, who now is sitting in the board of directors of Rosneft, the largest oil company in the world, and he does the bidding of the Russian Federation and their interests in European parliaments, and he is going around the world promoting Russian interests. The Russians have hired more than 50 German politicians who retired from office and journalists to do exactly that on a smaller scale. So what they're doing in Germany, they're doing in dozens of other countries. So if anybody asks me what are they doing here in the United States, it doesn't really take me to make a wild guess. I know what they're doing. The question is, how successful are they? And that's the only question I can answer, of course. But at the end of the day, they're doing this not because they have an ideology. Putin is not an ideological person. Putin is a pragmatic guy. The question right now, why Russians are behaving and doing what they're doing is, they're doing this because they're protecting their assets. It's all about money. It's about money that they have stolen. It's about money that ends up in our economies. It ends up in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, in Cyprus, I don't care, wherever you go. And it ends up here because we are democracies. We have the rule of law. They're using our rule of law to protect their stolen assets. Isn't that beautiful? And at the same time, they're trying, and this is the Russian idea at the moment, to bring our societies more close to their understanding of democracy, to their understanding of what the rule of law should be. The rule of law, Russian style, at the moment is the following. Vladimir Putin said that. He says, for my enemies the law, for my friends everything. Thank you. That's all I had to say.
Hello, thank you for coming. Very interesting. My name is Samuel Corey. I'm just a student here at UVU, studying Russian, so we're actually all here for my Russian class. I just have one question. From your experience with Vladimir Putin and what you've seen develop since your experiences there in Russia, do you feel like there's any possibility of a Russia after Putin to reconcile with the West, to create a better relationship with the West?
Absolutely, absolutely. And my big hope is the young generation. It's the young kids on the street today that we'll be dealing with the next 10, 15, 20 years. And Russia is a place where young people get into high positions rather fast. And you know, I have seen that the same way. When we recruited people, we would not recruit from the police force. We would recruit right out of the military. We would recruit right out of school or university, because these guys we could work with, these guys we could shape. And the same thing is true here. When you see Mr. Putin is already putting into place the next generation. We have a cabinet, average age is like something like 50. So you have people in there which are like 36, 37. You have people in there like old guy would be like 52. But it's all young technocrats, Putin trained. The problem for Mr. Putin is he trained them so they know what he does for a living. And they might just take that one day and put it against him. But generally speaking, Russia is a great place. I'm not allowed to say anything else. I've been married to a Russian citizen for 25 years. We have 2 children. But all fun aside, she has a German passport now, so she's no longer nice to me.
Thank you very much for coming today. You had said earlier in your presentation that you realized that bureaucrats in Russia didn't work on the honor system. As you probably know, they worked on the system of Grisha, right? Right. So you raised his name, but my first thought would have been that the quickest way to resolve this, if you use Russian business tactics, would have been to go to Gerhard Schroeder and said, can't we figure this out? And there would have been some kind of dogovor, some agreement. And was that ever an option, or did you only pursue legal action through the Swedish government?
The reality, give you a little story. We had the aviation show in Berlin, in Schönefeld, 2006 or 2007, 2007 I think. And Russia was the special guest country. Hurrah! Here it was, ready to go. So I get this phone call from the German Chancellor's office. Merkel is just in. Schröder just retired, but he didn't start work yet for the Russians. So I get this phone call from the person that is responsible for international commerce, international trade, which is the, working with the Ministry of Economic Affairs, etc. But he's there in the Chancellor's office. And so he calls me and he says, we have the International Airshow coming up, and Russia is a partner country. I said, yep. And he said, we all would like to keep the peace up there. And I'm like, I don't know exactly what you mean, but I think it's an excellent idea, the way you say it, but what are you trying to say? Well, we don't want you to enforce your claim there. I said, excellent idea. Are you going to pay me cash or send me a check? And the guy says, very German Burger, he says, this is not funny. So I say, I said, do what you like, I do what I want, because I got the judgment, I have to do what I got to do, unless you get me paid. That's it. So I'm expecting trouble as I'm going up there. So I bring my father along, Franz Senior, same first name, so he has a little fun. I have with me a camera team from the German state television, ZDF, Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen. I have with me 4 bailiffs, and we're getting pulled over by the German police, who is guarding the show at the parking place. And I roll down my window, we have Munich license plates, and the police guy says, Mr. Sedelmayer? I said, yes. I said, how do you know? He says, oh, we have all your family's license plates. They have 550 police guys taking care of security for the air show. And every single police guy has my license plate numbers. Hey, East Germany, hello? Wall still up? So, and then, of course, the bailiffs say, you cannot arrest us, we're just court bailiffs. So let the bailiffs go. Then the camera team says, we're just journalists, so they let them go. And then it's down to me and my dad. And they're looking, and they don't know which fronts to hold. And so local brass arrives, bunch of civilian guys, older guys, they have this big debate, and then they say, it must be the old guy, keep him. So I grab my backpack, I'm going off to the show on foot. They still have my dad in the car, and I hear my father screaming, you communists, the war. He just did a fabulous show. He had a wonderful time. He's a little anarchistic anyway, you know him. And we had a grand time. So I'm going into the show, and I get arrested again. So this time, I get arrested. I bought a ticket. I didn't jump the fence or anything. And they said, I'm a person non grata at the show. And they see the bailiffs surrounded, 4 bailiffs surrounded by 50 Russians. Lively discussion like this. Everybody's screaming. The press is filming. Things are clearly going on. So they accompany, they basically tell me to start walking to the gate. So I arrive at the gate. I see my camera team, now they're filming me, and there's a police car coming, and there's a policeman jumping outside. He's Kommissar Wassermann. And he says, Mr. Sedelmayer. I said, yes. I'm here to take you to the police station so you can file your complaint. Have you ever heard of such a service? It's amazing.
Only in Germany.
Only in Germany, exactly. And so at the end of the day, we did actually more damage to the reputation than it was necessary. I was just after their Roscosmos exhibits, because they would be worth money for people that like space suits and things like that and models. But they thought I'm there to get their new Tupolev prototype. And the economic delegation, that is politicians, journalists, and everybody that came to the show, flew in on that airplane. So there's 3 days left for the show. So these guys are really nervous about me because they don't know what I'm going to do next. So they say, everybody on the plane, we're flying home. So you have this wonderful TV picture with this Russian senior correspondent from NTV who says, see the empty tarmac behind me? That's where our prototype Tupolev was standing, and it's safe. Sedelmayer did not get it. And then they switch over to Moscow, and the plane is just landing. And so they interview the delegation chief, and he says, how come you came in so early? And the guy says, the weather was so nice, so we had to fly. So much for support from German government or any German politician.
Yeah. Which simply means your Krisha was weaker than the Russians, right?
Well, I don't think we have Krishas in Germany, to be honest with you.
So I actually have a question. You said that your litigation took longer than expected, approximately 11 years. I'm wondering if you see the Russian Federation using your similar experience to bolster such a defense in the future, or if you'll be able to use your experience to help other individuals in a similar circumstance.
Right. That's exactly what I'm in business for. I mean, I don't try to sell this book. By the way, it's in the bookstore. That's exactly what I do for a living. We have seen that Russia now has, for the first time, put together, this is 3 or 4 years ago, a competent center of lawyers, of Russian lawyers, who defeat against claims such as UCOS. UCOS is a very important case because it goes to show the willingness of Western courts to make sure that somewhat of rule of law is upheld, even in the worst of circumstances. Mr. Khodorkovsky, who was one of the early oligarchs founding the UCOS oil company, was arrested after he had clashed with Mr. Putin publicly on television in the Kremlin. And Mr. Putin basically said, you know, how did you pay your taxes? And that was sort of the red light thing. And of course, Mr. Khodorkovsky was used to the Yeltsin regime, so he didn't take Mr. Putin quite as seriously as he should have taken him. The word now is always, I was ready to go to jail in Russia for my beliefs. Not so. He just didn't count on the fact that somebody's really going to arrest him. He just was underestimating the situation. And now he's out. He's a better person, obviously. He's very much involved in supporting democracy in Russia. They have a wonderful organization out in Washington, D.C. with professional journalists where they publish a lot of interesting stuff. But his reputation in Russia is not as strong as one would think it is, because they're still looking at him as someone who benefited from the privatization process. Privatization for Russians is another word just for stealing. As is, you know what the word is for baton, police baton? It's demokratisator. So they have their little names for everything. The Russians became very effective in defending, not so much against judgments and awards. They usually end up losing the court case or the arbitration tribunal. But they have been very effective in attacking the judgments. In my case, they attacked the award, and they attacked it with 20 different isolated arguments. Usually it would be the tribunal is not competent to rule on the matter because they have no jurisdiction. The lack of jurisdiction would entail that there's an arbitration agreement. When it comes to bilateral investment treaty, it's not a private contract between the parties, as would be in an arbitration agreement with a, be a consumer or between two business companies, whatever. This is an arbitration clause, and a third party will be a beneficiary to get to use it, which would be me, the investor. And they basically said the entity expropriated in Russia was an American company. It was not a German citizen. That's why they have no competence. And in our treaty it reads, any type of assets that are expropriated. Any type of assets could also mean that it could be an American company owning assets on the ground that are expropriated. So it's not necessarily that you have to be a German entity per se. The American side to the story was that there was also a bilateral investment treaty in place between the United States and Russia. And the United States Congress had, in good faith, ratified that instrument. So it became law of the land here in the United States. But the Russian Duma, the Russian Soviet, I think it still was the Soviet at the time, the parliament, never ratified it. And the same was true with UCOS. They never ratified the Energy Charter Treaty. They never ratified it. They have a clause in the treaty that says when the countries sign this treaty, all the clauses are applicable until such time as ratification takes place. So what has happened is, and I had the day before the UCOS judgment came out in the Netherlands concerning whether or not the arbitration award will stand, I had a law conference in London. And one of the big topics was what's going to happen with UCOS tomorrow. And everybody in the audience, all English solicitors, were very positive that they would prevail. And we had this discussion, and one thing I remember saying was that we had 2 identical decisions in Sweden by the appellate courts there, which basically said that as long as it's not ratified, they don't accept the treaty as applicable, thus there is no arbitration agreement, and thus the award is null and void. And that's exactly what has been decided by the Dutch court. What the Russians have learned, if you concentrate on 1 or 2 things to attack, you're more effective than you would address 20 issues.
In reading in your book, I recall that the former mayor of Leningrad, who was very charismatic and I think to whom Putin was very loyal at one point, I think after he was out of office, went on a trip and mysteriously passed away, and I think Putin had arranged the trip, as I recall the details. So as I'm listening to you talk about confiscating 6 of these Russian assets along the way, have you ever felt that your life is in danger?
Yeah, well, initially you start thinking about that stuff, but after a while you give it up because you want to get some sleep at night. The point is, I deal with it when I come to it. What has happened in all the years is we had exactly 1 threat. And there was a phone call by a Kremlin official to my wife, and it went something like this. He said in Russian, we're gonna put your husband in if he doesn't stop the enforcing process. That was the extent. So I wrote a letter to my government. I wrote a letter to the German prosecutor general, to the Russian prosecutor general, and basically made it official. I named the person, I named the time, I explained the content of the conversation. And then the deputy chief of the Upravljanje delami Presidenta wrote back to me, oh, your wife is a very bad translator. We just meant it through the courts, through the legal system we're going to do you in, not physically.
Hello. My question is that you were mentioning that Vladimir Putin has a very, he's very good at mimicking and manipulating the people who he talks with. The people, how George W. Bush thought, you know, he's a wonderful guy, but John McCain was able to say that he was just a cold-blooded, manipulative killer. And you also proceeded to say that, for example, President Trump and President Vladimir Putin are very similar in the way that they are eccentric, charismatic, very rash in their decisions. My question is, the fact that they are both very similar in personality and very similar in the way they control their countries, does that, would that, in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, would that be a easier way, the fact that they're so similar, an easier way to manipulate or try to perceive relationships with the United States?
Well, you know, it's sort of an interesting situation. When you look at it, again, prima facie, you see a Putin who has been very successful in doing what they're doing, destabilizing us a little bit, throw us off a little bit, creating a little, maybe not hysteria, maybe it's too much of a word, but at least we have a discussion, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. And so he comes from a very, other circumstances. The Russians accomplished their mission. You know, with the Steele dossier, you can see the Russians accomplished their mission. It became part of the discussion that nobody needed, nobody wanted. And whether it's true or not is completely secondary. Of course, this is everybody's dream in the intelligence services to provide this type of what they call compromat, of legend, which of course is not true. But when it's published, it's out there. So you can argue it either way. And so for Mr. Trump, I'm always astonished what positive energy he has to try to pick up the ball with Mr. Putin. And when you see the two, you know, at the few meetings that they had, you can see there's a genuine interest to talk and to have a relationship. The problem is, what type of a relationship will it be? My question is, does Mr. Putin take Mr. Trump as serious as Mr. Trump takes Mr. Putin? And this is where I have my doubts. I think Mr. Putin is better at manipulating a situation and a person than Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump is a very outgoing guy when he wants to be and when he wants to do his stuff. And you know, he's a business person, let's face it. Putin is a KGB-trained recruiter. He can control the situation and the relationship a little better than Mr. Trump. It's not a business deal they're running here. This is politics. And one thing, and you know, it's funny because when you look at who surrounds Mr. Trump, you have Rex Tillerson, excellent person. You have Mr. Mattis, Secretary of Defense. You have Mr. Kelly, Chief of Staff. And you know that they know what we know. And it's a completely different picture than Mr. Trump portrays. So my gut feeling is that Mr. Trump remembers his business days, and he remembers the Russians very fondly, because obviously there were good business relationship at a time. So he has a completely different relationship and a completely different set of experience than the other guys who do business and do daily business in politics per se. And one thing I do know, Russia is not our friend. Russia is not our friend right now, and it will not be our friend until the day Mr. Putin and his people will leave office. And I think if we all understand that message, if we all get back on the same page, if we fix our transatlantic relationship, which I believe has been damaged along the lines, if the Europeans would get back together, and if the NATO members would take up the same strategy again, facing a problem that we all have. It's not just one country that has the problem. We have a Russia. It's smaller. It's not as potent militarily, strategically, economically as we would like to make believe. As you can see in the press, Mr. Putin is not as rational a person as someone that we can calculate what he will do the next year or 2 or 3. He permanently surprises us. Why? Because he permanently surprises himself. It's very simple. He has no long-term plan. And as long as we know that and you come back on the same page, I think we can live with this Russia until it will change. But it will be our mission to make a change, to help it change, I hope.
Hello, my name is Eugene Seeley, and welcome to Utah, by the way. It's so good to have you here. I teach international business, and I have a question post-Putin. One day, however it happens, you know, Russia is no longer led by Putin. How do you see the situation with the corruption? My background expertise is with Latin America. We've seen Chile roll back the corruption. We see Colombia fighting it. We see Mexico kind of go back and forth, but we see some great movements towards, for business, reduction of corruption recently in the cell phone industry and such. Mm-hmm. What do you think would happen in a post-Putin era for businesses? Do you think the corruption would recede? Do you think just another Putin would rise up, like Venezuela's problems? What do you think would be the situation for international business in Russia post-Putin?
I think it has a lot to do with how Russians perceive us. Because right now, they just look at us as some type of a safe haven. I mean, their children are here, going to school. Their wives are here. They have second, third homes. They have 2 and 3 passports because they know one day the gravy train in Russia will stop. The closest comparison to corruption that you might have from South America and Russia would be Venezuela and Cuba. Very similar, because very similar regimes, very similar transformation into some type of a capitalist form, yet only few will benefit, which explains exactly the situation. The business side of things will be the easiest part to change because that will come naturally, because you're going to have people out there. And if they understand, and when they understand, that this is no longer a safe place for money that has been obtained illegally, then it will be a natural, it will be a given that this will be a more honest way of dealing in business for the future. But as long as they see they get away with this stuff inside their country because they have a selective application of law. You know, if you know somebody who has a krisha, guess what? No prosecutor will follow up on you. No policeman will investigate you. No tax police will look at your balance sheets. You're free to go. But if we take that safety measure away, and we have this leverage because their money is here, I mean, you all heard about the sanctions list that was published, and Mr. Trump, I don't know how he said it, but it's basically said it's enough to have it as a threat, so we don't have to deploy it. I completely disagree. I completely disagree, and just for one simple reason. The reason for the interference of Russia, the meddling into our affairs, the support of organizations, political parties which will be a danger for our own democratic system, is all coming from funds, not necessarily coming from the Russian budget, it's coming from private interests. And I think some of the investigation here in America has shown it has come from the oligarchs or organizations close to them. So it's in our own best interest, and I'm saying this as a German, not as an American, because I don't make a difference here, because we all have the same problem. It would be a very good idea to enact these sanctions, to actually curb that, and to make sure everybody understands you can deal with us, but you can deal with us in a manner that is open, that is honest. We want to know where your funds come from, for example. I mean, I just transferred money because I bought a house in Spotsylvania, close to Fredericksburg, and I had 2 weeks of paperwork to show, I as a German, that I have obtained money legally to send it to the United States. And it was not a problem for me. I don't see why a Russian should be treated any differently. And the English have just passed a new law. It's the unexplained wealth regulation, which I think is a good step in the right direction because, as you know, England has been criticized for being a little bit too open for foreign funds. And basically it opens the possibility for any law enforcement officer, tax police, prosecutor, to go and put a temporary freeze on assets until such time as the beneficiary of those assets can explain where they come from, how they were obtained, if there is any suspicion of foul play. I think this would be a very necessary law here in the United States, which might be even more effective of an instrument than just a sanctions list. But the names on the sanctions list, I think, are perfectly okay. But, you know, a tiger without teeth is not going to bite you. And as long as he can't bite you, you have no reason to be afraid, and that's why you have no reason to change.
Do we have a final question at this point? Okay, well, before we close, I just want to make an announcement. I just want you to know that the UVU bookstore is actually selling Mr. Sedelmayer's book just right outside here. They're actually giving a 20% discount today for this event. If you would like to purchase one, you can just go ahead and do that, and you could even have the author sign your book if you're interested in that. Well, once again, this has been enlightening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
For his presentation and for being with us at UVU.